We're going to start a short series of teaching about prayer. Now, if you're like a lot of Christians, sometimes prayer can seem kind of awkward and a little bit of a challenge at first. You wonder if you're doing it right. Sometimes we can let those questions weigh on us so heavy that we just avoid it altogether. I feel like when I pray, I'm not saying the right words, or I feel like I get too distracted. Sometimes I feel like maybe it's not working. You know, I need to get somebody who's better at it than me. And especially those feelings can be exasperated or really amplified when you're with other people. And you're with other Christians and you're in a circle and we're all praying together and two or three of them have prayed and it's been really, you know, and you're thinking kind of a really pretty prayer, and now it's your turn to pray and you just feel like you can't get the words together at all. And so for some Christians, they just start to avoid it and they don't do it. They just avoid prayer altogether. And when you do that, when you make that kind of a decision in your Christian life, you're just missing so much of what makes our relationship with Jesus a relationship. You know, that we're talking to him and that we're sharing our heart and that we're trying to explain our thoughts in our minds. And there's this notion all the way through the Bible that we're called to live in his presence. And there's really nowhere that being in his presence is more profound than when we push ourselves to pray. And when we allow ourselves to really have some time and to focus in on prayer with Jesus, with God. So what I want to do today is just talk about what Jesus lays down as a model prayer. And it's mentioned 2 times in Scripture. It's mentioned once in Luke, and in Luke the disciples ask him, "Hey, tell us how to pray." And he tosses this prayer out. And then in Matthew, it's in the Sermon on the Mount, and it's in the middle of a longer section about religion, really, and about how sometimes religion can get out of hand. And with prayer, where religion can get out of hand is that you might be good at praying in front of people, but you're not really talking to God. Your main focus is what people will think of you and whether they will think you're righteous or whether they'll think you're spiritual enough. And so in the middle of that whole conversation, Jesus gives us a prayer, a model prayer. It's called the Lord's Prayer traditionally, though it really isn't him praying as much as him teaching us how to pray. If you really want a Lord's Prayer, maybe John 17 is a little better example of that. But it's called the Lord's Prayer because it's shown as a model from him. And not, again, so much as what to pray, but how. You know, what kinds of things should be in your motivation? What kind of things should you be thinking of? How should you approach God? And so don't feel like you have to it's great to memorize this. In fact, a lot of Christians memorize this prayer, and some churches pretty regularly will say it's part of their services, and that's awesome. Nothing wrong with that at all. But he never really commands us to do that. While that has some great value, and I would encourage you to do it too, it's not so much sent as a thing to recite, but as a model, a tool to teach you what kinds of things God expects us to pray about, and what kinds of things are best for us to pray about. So, with all that in mind, Matthew chapter 6, verse 9 and 10, he says, "This then is how you should pray. Our Father in heaven." Let's just start right there, right? In the Old Testament, God is hardly ever called Father. It does happen, but it's not the main way that he's referred to, and it's not the main way that he's talked about. Jesus really changes how God is looked at. It kind of single-handedly changes how God is looked at. He's our Father. And we can approach him like a father. Whereas the Old Testament usually more presents him as completely holy. And when God will give recitation about who he is, he will say things like he's the ever-loving God who's always merciful and always compassionate, who's always willing to forgive. He cites his attributes. And Jesus takes all of that notion and he says he's like a father. Now, I know some of you watching didn't have a great experience with your dad, and so this might actually be a bad word picture. So there's commercials now that have dad talking to the kid, but also there's TV dad, which is like this idealized version of what the father would be. That's kind of how you want to approach what Jesus is saying here too. You know, the perfect father who's there for his kids, who listens, who protects, who provides. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. I just want you to be respected, God. Hallowed means holy, made holy. I just want you to be respected. I don't want your name to be run down or trashed. At the very most minimal level, I don't want people using your name in vain, using your name like a cuss word. But more intently than that, I want people everywhere to respect you and to respect God, what you're about, what you have in mind to do. I guess I want them to see me and think good of you. So help me, God, to make your name holy and make how I feel about you respected. He says, your kingdom come and your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And again, this goes back to that idea of God's presence. In the Garden of Eden, we just walked in God's presence all the time. But man sinned and we broke all that, and now we're part of a cursed creation that is covered up in sin, and sometimes coming into God's presence is hard. The Israelites would build a temple or a tabernacle, a holy place they could go and just for a moment be in God's presence, provided they did all the right sacrifices. But what we're praying for is that we can dwell in God's presence, just like in the Garden of Eden, all the time. God, I just want your kingdom to be the same way here in my life, in my family, in my marriage, at my work, in my church. I want it to be the same here as it is there. That the spiritual and the secular will merge, right? That every part of me is thinking, what would Jesus do? And I want to be like Jesus, and I want to be like God's big dream for me. So I pray that your kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. The same way, God, that your word automatically works there, I want it to work here. That we obey your commands and that we follow your guidance and that we're part of your big plan to redeem this world. He says, give us today our daily bread. And that's kind of a callback to manna. Kind of a callback to manna. It talks of, in the Old Testament, if you remember in Exodus and in Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy and those books, it talks about God would provide for the people every day bread to eat. And he wouldn't provide more than just that day. Just enough for that day and just enough to get by, and they would have to wait on it. If they tried to store it up early, that food would go rotten before the next day. God, on purpose, wanted them to depend on him. This wasn't a super crazy hard lesson in the ancient world. I mean, most people worked enough today to provide for today, and a sickness of even 3 or 4 days could be devastating. For a family. An injury like a broken leg or an arm where you couldn't work could be catastrophic. The ancient world understood completely what it was like to depend on God for daily bread. Sometimes in a Western world, we lose sight of that. We have a bank account or a savings account. We have our house that's either paid for or paid for enough that it'd be hard to evict us today. And we can lose sight of that need we have for God every minute, that every breath is a gift from God, that every heartbeat is a gift from God, and that you can't control those things. The money that we count on, I mean, we see stories about banks failing or pension funds going under, and we know that nothing's guaranteed, though sometimes we forget it. And so this prayer redirects our focus. God, give me enough for today. Help me focus not only on my frailty, but your provision and your power and your strength, God. Help change. That's what you're praying for there. And forgive us our debts, he says, as we have forgiven our debtors. You could make a pretty big case here just about this word here, as. If you really did pray this, God, forgive me as I forgive other people, would you be in some trouble then? I mean, think about that. If God's only going to forgive you as much as you forgive, in fact, with that in mind, the next verse after this one, he says that real directly. He says, if you forgive other people when they sin against you, your heavenly Father will forgive you. But if you don't forgive others, then why would you expect him to forgive you? And at some level, well, at a lot of levels, this seems pretty harsh. I mean, wait a minute, God, you're saying like forgiveness is like the unforgivable sin or something like that? And I don't think that's what he's saying. Though I don't want to take the sting away from this. This is meant to be hard, and for that matter, so is that. It's meant to be a reminder that God's grace to us is just that. It's grace. It's nothing that we've earned. It's entirely on his favor. And God says, Jesus, when he's telling us this, expects us to forgive freely as we hope to be forgiven freely by God. And when we don't do that, when we hold grudges, when we hold stakes against somebody else somehow, some way, that we have elevated their sin and at the same time kind of minimized ours. We've assumed that their sin is so much worse than anything I might possibly have done to God. And it's an insult a little bit to God's holiness and to God's grace and to God's kindness to us. When I withhold forgiveness, it's like I don't really understand what God's done for me. So part of that prayer is, God, help me understand what you've done for me. Help me understand how big it is. And when I forgive somebody else, especially for something gigantic, I'm re-educating myself on that point. He says, and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. And not just evil, but from the devil and from whatever he has in mind. God, help us to see that there's more going on than just me getting through today. There's a spiritual warfare going on. And that at some level, God, if I don't pay attention to it, I'll get swallowed up by it. So help me avoid temptation. You know, for most of us, we know what the big temptations are. The devil is a lot of things. He's cruel and mean and hateful, but he's not creative. And what knocked you down yesterday will probably be in his arsenal to try to knock you down again today. So pray about that. God, you know how I am. But don't focus on it. You pray about it. You trust God for his provision and get your mind on these other things too, right? Sometimes focusing on it's like having a donut in your refrigerator. I don't want the donut. I don't want the donut. And the more you say that, the more you kind of do want. So pray about it. Ask God to come in and give you strength, and not just strength, but as part of this spiritual warfare that we're in, and then move on. Trust that God's going to move on. Actually, the just move on thing, you could take as a lesson from the Lord's Prayer that our prayers should be short. And I don't know if that's exactly the right lesson you want to pull out here, but clearly what he's teaching us is not a sweet hour of prayer, right? At the very most, a sweet 30 or 40 seconds of prayer. And I think what he's hoping for is this continual conversation. You know, we're not just trying to beat God up with a long list of things. We're just trying to get our focus right. And there's certainly a time for the long list of things. When I'm grieving or when something's going on in my life that just completely swallows my attention, yeah, you should pray about that and pray at length. And there's other places where Jesus will commend disciples for not giving up easy. Keep knocking on the door. Just keep knocking. Just keep knocking. Just keep coming back. So I don't think you want to take solely as a lesson all of our prayers should be short. But there's a value in just getting your mind on Christ. Take a short moment. Get your mind on Christ. Let him move in you. And that's what this lesson's about. And that's a good place for you to start as you're trying to build up a habit of prayer.